Thank you so much, Patrick. This was absolutely wonderful. Tour d'horizon, tour de force, actually also you touch on so many issues. And I think the statistics are very impressive. The maps you've drawn several maps. I think they're extremely instructive. But before maybe going into this, I'll allow Aziz to comment. Professor Aziz Salmone Fall is a Pan-African political scientist. He's a member of the Executive Secretariat of the International Workers and International of Workers and Peoples, president of the Centre Internationaliste Réaction Foundation Urban, and he's the coordinator of the International Campaign Against Impunity, Thomas Sankara. He lectures at McGill University and at the Université du Québec in Montreal, Canada. He is a brother, a close friend, a recognized leader of the social movement, not only in Africa, but across the South. Been together in many places, all the way to Bandung a couple of years ago, celebrating the 60th anniversary. He's been very, very close to Samir Amin, has done a lot of things, led a campaign against foreign military bases on the continent, AFRICOM films. He uses different intervention mechanisms. He has obviously all the traditional academic, outputs, books and journal articles, but he also does films and documentaries, which are very powerful ways of communicating, of not only recording things, but also sharing great ideas. So Aziz has done, a film on AFRICOM. He's done a film on Samir Amin. He's done a lot of other films as well, which could be found on his website. And he's a great speaker. And I would just plead with him not to try to compete with Patrick in terms of the time, but definitely take the floor to, help us come back to some of the key issues that Patrick raised in a critical fashion, and then maybe open discussion to the audience. So Aziz, you have the floor.
Hello to the Global Youth founders and members, and to all participants. I'm so proud to see the achievement and outreach of Global Youth, and due to probably, and I have to salute the tireless effort of Margaret and Kinshi and all our fellow members. I am honored to be in the presence of Ebrima and Patrick Bond, with whom I have had the pleasure of meeting on many platforms around the world over the past 20 years and so, and who I believe represent the prototypical models of organic intellectuals and defenders of the oppressed. As you know, we all missed our beloved Samir Amin, but he is always in spirit with us. I guess not just the young students were delighted to watch this amazing selection of slides and a great talk of Patrick Bond. I even suspect the monkeys to come also to witness. I think what he delivered today on the crisis of capitalism, the climate crisis, Africa in the world economy, and the social movements opposing it is quite comprehensive. The originality of Professor Bond's comprehensive theoretical effort on some Africa's uprising and movements in the past decades, and regime change from below, here was probably to try to show the resilience, the resistance, and the organized or the unorganized revolt of the people in the face of the neoliberal wave, but also to highlight the paradox of a state disengaged from the economy, and at the same time, even more authoritarian in organizing the conditions of accumulation, then also in resorting to repression in the face of disruptive protests. The nature of this resistance is probably quite complex because we have disruptive protests, we have micro protests, we have community efforts, we have youth protests, and sometimes genuine organized popular struggles. So I will not really go back over the clarity and conciseness of Professor Bone's presentation and impressive selective slides. I would just rather address a few issues that he can probably shed more light on than I can, that I still find a bit problematic. One is, in fact, our own readings. We revolutionary intellectuals are often overly enthusiastic about the reaction of the popular masses and the form of popular resistance, and often interpret their objectives and results positively or even exaggerately, expecting sometimes them to lead to fundamental changes. This comes probably from a reading that focuses on the reaction and not on the organization and structural or sometimes non-structural nature of the phenomenon that we are studying. So in fact, we focus on reaction, and I'm not sure reactions are necessarily deep enough to portray the magnitude of what is really happening. The neoliberal state borrows neoliberal agenda, often by graft, but the African state is not itself neoliberal. We also have to distinguish between what is intrinsic to the historical political nature of the state or the so-called state, and existing modern and cultural political forms that are in fact imbricated to pre-colonial modes of regulation that have not yet disappeared, but are still functioning in the hybrid state that we study. So the narrative of dissent is also based on our own frustration and proactive activism. And this may actually bias our reading of the struggles and the way we portray them as human-centered, Afro-optimistic, and Africa rising phenomenon. One of the key ways to understand what I'm trying to say here, after hearing what Patrick have clearly portrayed, is to ask what ultimately happened on the Africa rising or uprising after the major revolts of Tunisia, Mali, Burkina Faso, Libya, Egypt, and recently Algeria. And the phenomenon of restoration or reformist change in a destabilized autocratic populist regime that is actually begging for the neoliberal agenda. So here I think we have to look with a lot of scrutiny the tiny margin of maneuver of the state. One of the other way of looking at this phenomenon is to look exactly as Patrick have done it in the past 20 to 30 years, focusing on intense struggles for democratic reform, but also raising the complex question of how structural adjustment and extractive industries have reshaped the continent way of integration in the global economy, but also to raise the complex question of what are in fact the foundations and determinants of authoritarianism, which may or not allow democracy. And lessons learned from Asia show that sometimes authoritarianism could also lead to development or even forms of democracy. So I kind of remember, and maybe we should go back to Kwandarire, as you mentioned, but also Bangura, who actually questioned the structural precondition for sustenance of democratic systems in African countries, not just relying on the effect of structural adjustments, but also on the so-called mimic of the democracy system, mainly multi-party system, free elections, civil rights, and so on. One of the originality of Bangura's approach was that democratic struggles were placed, as actually Patrick did, in a wider social economic context on a global scale, but also on the local scale. And when it comes to really analyze the institutional and historical reality, we can see that the forms of accumulation actually interact with a number of socioeconomic variables, which actually really determine the nature of the actual political system or the dominant political system. And one of the interesting way that Bangura was portraying the analysis, not just criticizing the neo-patrimonial agenda and so on, was that in fact, three dominant patterns of accumulation as transnational capitalist production, rent-seeking capitalism, and petty commodity production. And he demonstrates in a way that it was the strength or the weakness of these patterns interacting with variables such as rural-urban integration, welfare services, social system, and state civil society's relation, which actually ultimately determine the shape of the political regime. And then we can focus on different cases to see what may be the difference between Nigeria, Ghana, in the Anglophone sphere, including the Southern African countries, and compare them with the so-called Latin experience, the French Francophone Africa and so on, or the Northern African cases. But anyway, what I find important here is that we have to distinguish the overall resistance, the dissents. First, the first level that psychologists will define as resilience, which is basically how our societies and our people, our masses, are adapting in face of adversity, how they adapted in face of the trauma of colonial system, the failure of independences, the tragedy of this neoliberal agenda, the many threats that are still around. So how do we adapt to this massive stress that Patrick had analyzed? And this is a basic resilience, which I think we don't analyze enough, because I think this is where in fact lies the most bigger potential. That's exactly what allows us to resist from, on the long run, from the slavery period to the colonial era. This resilience is in fact the core of anything that is the vital force of the African continent, resisting the tide of the global accumulation. Then we enter, for those who are more active, and the resistance as a daily act of opposition to anything that is unjust, oppression, etc., can lead to another level. So this level of resistance is already something that we need to analyze. What is the difference between resilience and resistance? And when this resistance is a little more organized, how it leads to rebellion, which is probably something that is more grandiose, more difficult to analyze, as it could be spontaneous, as it could be also organized. And it is led to specific events. It can be just the rise, inflation, rise of prices, or discontent about like what is happening these days in Haiti, could be a regular protest that would really upset the order of the daily life. So this explosion that we have seen in Tunis, that we have seen in Egypt and in Burkina Faso, which is like an explosion of resistance, is happening with youth that are often depoliticized, in fact, because the neoliberal agenda have organized a depoliticized agenda, and we didn't really have time to go through this, but I think one of the big institutional work of the structural adjustment was, in fact, the framing of the political dimension of adjustment, which was governance. And I think governance had created immense damages in the structural superstructure of the African states. And one of the hegemonic side of the governance phenomenon was the depoliticization and the fragmentation of civil society into clusters, you know, these for water, these for women condition, these for rural access to water, etc., etc. And so we have micro protests which are linked to this civil society that is part also of the neoliberal agenda, as civil society was not a counterpower, but also part of the neoliberal agenda to transform and contain the states. So as resistance and rebellion can address the flaws in societal systems, we always hope that the conjunction of all this resistance and protest will lead ultimately to revolution. And often we have seen this phenomenon of uprising, this upheaval, being transformed with great hope to a revolutionary phenomenon. Unfortunately, they are not tackling the structural basis of the state, nor the structural reason of development. And one of the big, I think, problem we have is also our reading of development. We are all caught up in the paradigm of development, and I think that our critique of development is an essential core of a Pan-African reading of what is happening. I would hope to see a more Pan-African, let us say, thirst in this movement to really rally this phenomenon, not like local and national problems, but to really see the bigger picture. Unfortunately, we don't witness yet the consciousness that these problems are in fact Pan-African. We see them are locally driven. And I think this is, again, one of the big tasks ahead of us is how we can repoliticize democratically the masses, using all this phenomenon to channel at least this energy. Otherwise, it could be a big waste, and a big waste is, I think, what happened in the 90s. In the 90s, there are a lot of hope on the so-called democratic system that was masterminded also by the West, but local bourgeoisie. And we have also to again go back to the debate that Colin Lees and other good friends have raised on the nature of the African bourgeoisie, and try to see what have been crystallized. Do we still have this kind of comprador strata today all over the places? Do we have national bourgeois, casta that have emerged and crystallized in some African countries? And the big debate on the nature of our so-called delinking processes. The only experience had been the case of Burkina Faso. 4 years, we don't have other examples close to the end of the 20th century. So this is why all this work that Patrick Bond and his comrades are doing in South Africa is so important. And again, I think those who actually witnessed this presentation today can see the holistic effort that Patrick have tried, well, also to adapt to this new generation, with images and, mind-blowing ways of refreshing what is happening around. I will not really elaborate on the nature of the jihadist groups that are also very opportunistically trying to squeeze into this phenomenon. Just remembering that the two-day revolution in Iran have opened the door to fundamentalist groups, and what is actually building in this, what I call Sahelistan, basically Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and stretching now to the Horn of Africa, is about also kind of a big thrust, I think, that we have to really decipher what is happening between frustration, lack of development, legitimate effort of the population to ask for a different development, but the culturalist temptation to fall into fundamentalist phenomenons. Not to mention other big threats, particularly the case of the Nile problem in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. That is probably quite a bombshell for the whole sake of the African continent. So we need to pay attention to this phenomenon as population are driven to also participate in protests related to these issues. For example, today, if we look at what is happening in Mali or in Burkina Faso, we can see that slowly this phenomenon is dividing the population across culturalist religious lines, where the state has almost shrinked to its minimal dimensions. So again, thank you so much, Patrick, for all this insight and amazing analysis of yours. It's a pity we don't have much time and more time to devote to your analysis, but again, thanks for having me commenting your great paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aziz. Those were excellent comments. I think you brought in you dimension and the big question definitely that you're asking, or the questions you've asked a number of questions, but one of them is the real nature of these movements, and what happened to the ones that we've seen, arising over the years in different places, different parts of the continent, and the way in which also the real nature of the African state, whether it's a neoliberal state proper or it's a hybrid kind of state, and where all this is taking us, and the structural dynamics, and how do we move from, the differentiation that's important to make between resilience and resistance, and how do we, in a sense, make sure that all this thing is geared towards maybe futures that we desire, and not just left to chance or getting them to succeed after a while, or taking new, or being in a sense a reincarnation of or letting a way in which neoliberalism can reproduce itself in new ways, and making the system, I'm using the term, and a new lease of life. But there's certainly a number of issues that we've brought up which are extremely important that complement the presentation that Patrick was making. I'm sure Patrick has a lot of things to say in response. If it was possible to get him to speak only for 2 minutes, I would say a quick reaction in 2 minutes while we allow people who want to speak. Please use the chat to raise issues, to comment as well. I'm speaking to both the other panelists and to all the people who are on the other, also following this conversation. And at the same time, if you want to speak at some point, you raise your hand, you go to the icon. There is a place where you have participants will see at the bottom how to raise your hand. You raise your hand to get the floor. But I'm just giving a chance to Patrick to respond very quickly and very briefly, Patrick, to some of the most burning issues or that you feel like you want to respond to, and then we open the floor for the others to also speak. Patrick.
Thank you, comrades. And it's absolutely fantastic to have even 2 minutes to grapple with Aziz's challenge. He takes this point of view of, well, no lies and claim no easy victories. He takes it seriously. Thank you, Aziz, because sometimes I don't. I'm a romantic, and I love the sense that the world is always pregnant conditions where neoliberalism and authoritarianism have clamped down. So very quickly, the 3 things in 2 minutes. You've asked about our general approach to development. And you've also asked about whether the fragmentation of civil society, civilized society, suit and tie NGOs, social movements uprising, whether that fragmentation itself as a neoliberal condition we work under, where everyone is in their silo, is that debilitating? And thirdly, you've asked also about what those of us who are sort of scholars or scholar activists must be wary of. Very quickly, you've done a lot more, but those are 3 to reply to. And I think since this gathering, these are our friends and our allies who always worry about development. It's a term that in my context is generally seen as a good thing, because South Africa underdeveloped the vast majority of the residents. So development is a good thing. But what we've got from especially the pink tide in Latin America and its limitations, its fossil related limitations in Venezuela, in Ecuador and Bolivia, where resistance movements came up to ask, don't we need, if not a post-development, something that is a buen vivir, a summa causa, it's a sort of different, that is sensitive to environment and indigenous people and women and youth and the climate. There, I think we all of us in the House have begun to see how difficult this work is. We saw it perhaps best in Ecuador, where a group called Pachacutic came up and nearly challenged for state power in a February election. And they had a leader, Yacu Perez, who nearly came in second in the presidential election, and then withdrew support from the pink tide, the Keynesians, especially of the Correa faction, who had proven in the Amazon, in the Andes, to be insensitive during their years in power, terribly insensitive to indigenous people, to the environment, to women. So it was such a conflict, exactly, Aziz, over what you're asking us to do is to envisage a different development in which the traditions of the left that would ordinarily support Hugo Chavez or Evo Morales or Rafael Correa or their successors now has to confront their contradictions. And I think we're not quite at that stage, but we should be acutely aware, especially because now in Brazil, Lula, if he wins next year, will be reproducing the same contradiction of promoting development, but that which is still extractivist. It's still based on fossil fuels and on minerals and on hydrocarbons. So that's the first point. The second is whether you've got, let's say, a cul-de-sac in which working with civil society means you can't really connect the dots and have an ideology that allows you to take the state. And partly, I think your argument about the limitations of what in North Africa and in the recent rebellions, the regime changes from below, the limitations of carrying those forward into genuine, robust democracies that meet people's needs. You're absolutely right. And you've put it so well in structural terms. So I'd like to very quickly show, to address this, what I think some of the dilemmas are of particularly trying to reform African states are difficult because of the structural conditions. And typically what the reformers do, and we see this in the NGO circuit all the time, is adopt the internal logic of a system, a neoliberal system, by simply smoothing its rough edges and then re-legitimizing that system and giving confidence to the status quo, leaving activists disempowered or co-opted, and confirming, in a way, what you described as the limits of change, of a revolutionary change, because of fear of power, of apathy and cynicism. And that tendency of NGOs, especially, to promote reformist reforms is debilitating. It means that these systems, even after a state, power is changed, as in South Africa, still leave the people absolutely desiccated. Now, there's a different approach, which I remember talking many times with Samir about, which is non-reformist, reforms that undercut the internal law system, confronting the core dynamics, continuing to delegitimize the system of power, giving confidence to critical ideas and social forces, leaving activists more empowered with momentum for the next struggle by winning these reforms in between, and replacing social apathy with confidence in the integrity of the activists and their leadership. If I can give you one example, Aziz, where I think you might be wrong in saying there's been no delinking. Our best case in South Africa, and I think the continent, of delinking is for medicines. We desperately need this for COVID-19 vaccines and medical treatment. Our comrades all over are fighting to de-commodify and de-globalize the production of vaccines, right? So we can all get them across this continent. And we've run into the problem, of course, of WTO, trade-related intellectual property systems, EU and big pharma, and to some extent Biden administration, hold over IP because it's multinational capital's #1 form of power and profit, royalties and all of the IP power. And it seems to me that by winning that battle 20 years ago for AIDS medicines, we do, Aziz, we do have a delinking example that meets the kind of criteria of a non-reformist reform, and that Samir Amin was perfectly happy to endorse as a manifestation in one sector, with one set of movement activists, of that vision of delinking, to delink from big pharma's intellectual property, to decommodify, to make it free, to have AIDS medicines, to have them produced all over this continent in small pharmaceutical manufacturing factories. That to me is the answer. And then to the question of whether we can accumulate non-reformist reforms with the confidence and the ideological clarity to resist falling into reformist reforms that accept the limitations that you've eloquently pointed out. And a third point, very fast. I'll just make this very fast. I know you need Ebrima to control my babbling, but I would say that the intellectuals typically commit 10 types of sins in engaging in these struggles. I know because I commit them all, and I have done so. It's very embarrassing. Sometimes we gatekeep and hijack the movements we work with, right? We claim a particular insider knowledge, or worse, we substitute our ideas. We put our ideas in where they may not organically go, or even worse, we ventriloquize. We actually write press statements and documents together where we're really the authors, but claiming it's a social process. And in that sense, we're careerists, we're parasites in sucking on to our own benefit. And sometimes our petty bourgeois tendencies, again, I'm just speaking personally, are towards technicists, as I've shown you already, or legalists strategies. Sometimes we're divisive, profiling particular characters. Sometimes we engage in hucksterism, the false romantic visionary. And sometimes we settle scores, don't we, when we engage in these movements and say, no, my point was correct. Sometimes we have analytical nerve, right? Where our inability to draw out the fully liberatory potentials or to offer constructive critiques is evident. And finally, we even betray. We turn against a movement on dubious grounds. Hey, these are problems that I know I cause and that you've accused us of when we're promoting, as intellectuals, the Africans' uprising. I take those very seriously. I hope by being aware of them, we don't fall victim to them as much as we might otherwise. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Well, those 10 sins, political sins of this collectivism is something that we should all meditate upon and see how to avoid committing them, and what do we do when we see them committed. We have to have a mechanism for dealing with them, I think. A lot of things definitely on the agenda. I think you know, to come very quickly to some of the issues that both of you raised. First of all, at some point, Patrick, you asked the question of what the movements are saying, what the protests are saying, what people are saying. Actually, I think it speaks to the agenda really. It speaks to the real aspirations, to the kind of society, to the kind of world people, you know, want to live in, and how the kinds of relationships that they want to see built. And in that sense, I am not sure Aziz, whether it's really a question of the youth being depoliticized, as you say. One of the functions of structural adjustment, you're right, there has been an attempt, actually a real attempt and an effort to make sure that everything is presented as a technical matter. You know, everything has been sort of technicalized, and including governance. You know, so you know, so I think you know, but I'm not sure whether it's not so much the question of the ideology governing these movements, and you know, as Patrick was putting it, because I think once they get out in the street and raising political issues, even if at the start the motivation wasn't political or narrowly political, but in the end it becomes sort of, in a sense, a political protest. It takes a political turn to the point that it has led to, you know, regimes collapsing, orders coming up, and so on. So even if they didn't have the capacity to sustain it, that may have to do more to do with the ideology, the kind of alternatives that we're promoting, than to them not being politicized per se. So I just want us to come back to that and see how that can be framed. The distinction between reformists and non-reformist reforms is an interesting one, and I think it's something that we should pay particular attention to, and delinking whether it was successful in the case of what happened with the treatment action campaign in South Africa 20 years ago on HIV/AIDS, and what is possible today is another matter. But definitely, the context and the framework within which that delinking can be conceptualized, I think, is important. I think all of them, whether talking about Fanon or Cheikh Anta Diop, Fanon maybe not so much, but Cheikh Anta Diop definitely, Kwame Nkrumah and others, or even Samir, imagining delinking in the context of one country, doesn't seem to me to be what they were thinking about. I think they were thinking about it in a much more, in a broader perspective, with at the minimum continental level, but also Samir was a Southerner. He was much into the struggles of the South and seeing the importance of the South connecting with each other and then waging the struggles together. Well, I would just want to see whether there are any attempts. I haven't seen any hands. I'm not seeing everybody on the screen. I should be moving back and forth. But if nobody is asking for the floor, I'm not sure whether I can volunteer some people to take the floor. I've seen JK, Jomo, and others, and I would be, you know, really hoping that, Jomo, you can come in at this point to comment on this interesting debate. Kinchi, I hope you'll be joining us also.
Well, there's a question which asks about Pan-Africanism and about the what are the main forces behind the Pan-Africanism, and also how about the question of an African currency?
Pan-Africanism. He is the absolute guru, and I heard his talk the other day. Fantastic. But I would ask Aziz on the currency. It is a very interesting dilemma because it has been used, say, in the EU in a way that strengthened Germany as against Portugal and, you know, especially Greece and Spain at one point. And when they fell apart in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, the currency debate and whether staying in the euro was appropriate was very profound, because it doesn't solve problems of economic inequality. Sometimes it amplifies them. And when I asked at one point in a seminar, it was in Oxford, where the presenter was saying we need an African currency, a single currency. And this was like an Oxford Don who's well known for his flippant attitude. And you know, sort of where should this be? Would it be the South African, obviously the South African Rand, which is now a legitimate semi-hard currency, but at the time was an apartheid currency, was not on the agenda for debate. So this man said, no, there's only one place to have a single unified African currency. And that place is, as the central bank for Africa, that place is Brussels. So we were all saying, no. Now we see what you want to do with this notion. And probably Aziz and Ebrima can tell us what it means to be under the thumb of Paris when you have a currency control system. to me, one of the dilemmas of breaking out of that power, the power of finance, the power of the dollar, is the economic delinking. And in a context where currencies are insane and cyber currencies make it even more so, it is vital for us to add to the question the jubilee, the debt cancellation, and to try as much as possible to correlate, as Keynes said, our real import needs and our debt and the extent to which we can question as odious debt a great deal of the debt loads that are unrelated to locally produced need satisfaction. And I think that'll have to be the way forward for any country that wants to do something radical, is to avoid as much as possible the dollar and euro, and might be at that point the yuan as well. And also to figure out whether the non-currency related strategies, China and Russia, for example, having all sorts of interesting innovations in doing non-currency deals. But it does strike me that the first way to get about this is to take control of nation states and figure out what the Reserve Bank can do, and actually go back to John Maynard Keynes and Samir Amin and say, you know, job one, once you come to power, is exchange controls to get you your control, your monetary sovereignty back. But Aziz, the Pan-African question, where is it happening today?
This is quite a sensitive question. I was maybe start by China itself, as you know that the balance of currency, the blackmail that the trades, European Union and the States and Japan are exerting on China to balance the yuan. And the yuan always, the Chinese always say that, you know, you need to repatriate in gold what you own as in the United States are treasury bonds. So this big battle on currency was lost in Africa after the killing of Gaddafi, with the plan of our actual African monetary fund, and to have a single currency within 10 years. So this effort has been jeopardized with this killing in a way, and the African Union doesn't seem to have a clear plan. However, West Africa's 15-nation bloc have introduced a long plan of single currency. This had been delayed so far because of the effort of the France-Afrique to slow down the single currency, we call the ECO, and what would be the role of Nigeria and Ghana into this big basket of currency. But the ECO is the common currency that the West African Monetary Zone is about to introduce in a couple of years. Having said that, we still strive for a single currency as one of the most important tool of the delinking process. This is how, in fact, you manage your surplus, and with a central bank. This is the hope and the dreams of our generation, as it's also the motto of this event today. It's talking about hope. There is no way that we could be independent without that single currency. This is my understanding of the rule of the game. But our elites are not ready for that. But I think our masses are totally open. All the efforts to have currency delinked from the world capitalist system were jeopardized. The most interesting example was the Sili of Guinea that was sabotaged by France. So I still hope that we will have open-minded people working on this very issue. But truly the killing of Gaddafi and the effort of building this central bank was really a big blow to this effort. So we all look forward to what is happening with this common currency in West Africa, hoping that it will stretch then to the Central Africa zone. Now it is again a debate on whether it is integrated to the world capitalist system. This is what is now as a plan. We all are against this scenario. We would like to have something quite different, but truly this is not in the radar yet, unfortunately. Yes,
I think the question of the single currency, but also of Pan-Africanism, now is taking place, in a context when at the interstate level, they are moving towards this creation of this huge free trade zone, the African continental free trade area, which definitely, as it is conceptualized, is not an alternative sort of space, or a space where people's integration process is envisioned as such. It is mostly a kind of replica of the European Union type of integration that's been envisioned. Even if the way to get to it is different.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I was a bit late at the reception of this webinar. I have a point of view, but I'd rather raise a question.
Great, that's fine.
Yeah, relating to the issue currently discussed. The last decolonized country in Africa, South Africa, the Republic of South Africa, was, let's say, more or less industrially developed by the time of liberation. And the ANC Reconstruction and Development Program, based on the Freedom Charter, the ANC Freedom Charter, was the original plan. But after a few years, still under Mandela's governance, they had to relinquish this RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Program, and switch to a so-called GEAR program, Growth, Employment, and Redistribution, which was nothing but a remake of the usual structural adjustment program of the IMF at that time. And most of you, at least Patrick Bond knows what I'm talking about. Most of you should also know. So my point is, the basic issues Africa has to tackle, to deal with, in order to gain sovereignty and reconstruct our continent for the sake of our own people and not for the benefits of foreigners, or whether Europeans or Eurasians, Arabs, or even Easterners. The basis for implementing such an autonomous development program relies on our unification, on the political unity of the African continent. But every country, even the Gambia or Senegal, it's very tiny little colonies, are striving to rebuild their small territory on a so-called independent basis, which to me is radically unfeasible, impossible. So if we talk about opening new grounds and finding new ways for us, for African people, I think that even in terms of currency, you can see for how many decades ECOWAS has been setting dates, setting an agenda for what is now called eco-currency, but for a single currency for Western Africa. It's been at least 20 years since we've been delaying the deadline. And just after the French and Ivorian, attempt to sabotage, the eco-currency, the chief of state just recently postponed it to 2027 once more. And I'm afraid they can keep on doing this until the 22nd century. So my question is, how can we achieve political unification of our continent from the Mediterranean Sea to Cape Town and from Praia to Antananarivo as an organic totality? That's the real challenge. That's the basic issue. And I'm afraid the intelligentsia, you know, meaning the elite, as they put it, are just incompetent in that respect. So we had better check on the people's side, on the masses, to try and find a way to accomplish this political unity. Is it utopian or is it realistic? You know, that's the point. But as Sheikh Anta Diop used to put it, since it's on the name of realism that we have brought Africa to its present stage, isn't it high time to become utopist? That's my question.
You're right in emphasizing the political dimension in the sense that that's also the argument that somebody like Ndongo Sylla, was an economist, an African economist, makes, saying that you can have a single currency and it works only if you have some kind of political entity also at the federal level, some kind of a federation or a state. But a single currency with sovereign states that are different, you know, wouldn't work. That's one view among others, but just to bear in mind. Yeah, let me. And then also I have a question for both of you, for both you, Aziz, and Patrick. You know, the thing about the very sustainability of the movement itself, of these protest movements, beyond protest to, how do you go beyond protest to something that is structured and lasting, you know, engaging, that, you know, carrying an alternative, right? I think that probably is one of the big questions. What do we need to do to make sure that we go beyond protesting to be, you know, carrying out a strategy that is leading towards the kind of lasting changes that we are aspiring for? Many of the movements that we have start as protest movements, and they are structured as, you know, political movements at the level of one country, and then they tend to be, there's an attempt now to connect beyond the country level. They have, you know, platforms, the Africa platform, you know, and other platforms exist, but what is more difficult to see is the alternative program, the alternative sort of agenda, the thing that is this kind of society, the kind of Africa they're envisioning, is, I think it's much less clear to see. But the really big question is, how do you move from a protest movement, you know, all these things we've been seeing, to something, I guess that's one of the observations that Aziz also was making, you know, to something that is structured. I know Samir, one of his latest battles was to work towards the creation of a new international. You know, do we need something of that sort at the level of the continent, beyond the continent? But we certainly need maybe a way of saying, look, okay, because one of the things that one observes is a disconnect between the movements and the historical Pan-Africanist movement, or you know, some of the historic struggles that have occurred. You know, some figures are well known. Fanon is known to some. Cabral is known to some, but not probably not as well as he ought to be known. Kwame Nkrumah and all those ones. So there's a problem of the reclaiming that a sort of a kind of a legacy that is there already, and connecting with the struggles that have been waged on the continent before, and then moving on that forward to a new world that is definitely, you know, different from whatever even the Kwame Nkrumahs and the Sheikh Anta Diop could envision, simply because of all the changes that have occurred and all the issues that are on the agenda now. If they had elements of what that future could be like at some stage, I think definitely that future is something that has to be fashioned, entirely new, but in the spirit of what they were discussing during their time.
Aziz, you must get the last word on this because of two reasons. You're more than anyone else carrying forward Samir's will and testament, which was to get the Fourth International or Fifth International up and running. I think if I can quickly reply, especially Diallo was asking, where do social movements, the strength? And in Africa, we did try with the Africa Social Forum from around 2003 or 4, and it ran out of steam after about 7 or 8 years. But it felt to me, attending several of those, that was exactly what Diallo was looking at, which is how do you find routes to network across the continent? And especially because our model for this was Latin America, where there was a success. No one in the House will deny there were limitations, but there were successes in Latin American radical movements. For example, the movement of the landless workers in Brazil, the Kutch, the labor movement, finding not only that they could organize well in their sectors, but they could then come together, and they found a political party that they by and large supported with different currents. That was the PT, the Workers' Party. And that party, after trying from about 1989 till nearly winning on several occasions, finally the presidency was in their grasp in 2002. And it was when Lula won that we began to see, okay, there are strengths of making that strategy of building up your social movements, organizing well, not just a once-off protest to get rid of a tyrant. But then typically what you need to do is keep social movements and your trade unions strong, have parties that can form alliances. And maybe the traditional way of doing that was always Scandinavia's urban trade unions and rural movements that together had a majority and could institute social democracy. But I know with Qin Shi, with Margaret, many Chinese comrades, I don't know if Wen Tizhun is here, but the tradition of Maoism, of a revolution that could sustain itself through a very strong state, is another route. I think what we're looking at, in a way, is the failure of our Africa Social Forum to sustain, the failure of our trade union networks across the continent. And Diallo is exactly right that in South Africa, with the biggest proletariat, a formal, organized working class in the productive sectors, because of this economy's sub-imperial power, we saw in 2015-16 a split between trade unions that were pro-government and stay with the ruling party, the Nationalist Alliance, that's the Congress of South African Trade Unions, about 1.4 million members. And on the other hand, a movement of the left, led by metal workers, now within the South African Federation of Trade Unions, that persistently attacks the government as a neoliberal and authoritarian ally of international and domestic capital. That's the classic problem. We saw it in Zimbabwe. Many countries have gone through that. So we haven't found ways to figure out how to get those forces in a country like South Africa that has so much, we are the most unequal, the most corrupt capitalist class, according to PwC, the angriest working class from the World Economic Forum, but we haven't found a way to bring strong social movements with this labor unrest. I think it's because the ruling elite has successfully divided and conquered and found ways to continually keep dissent either formally repressed, the Maracana massacre, or co-opted. And I think that's just a period of time before we get beyond those limitations in this particular country. But whether for the continent as a whole, I'm going to turn it over to Aziz for inspiring visions of Pan-Africanism, whether we're still going to have to work without an African Social Forum, sector by sector. If so, I'll just throw out 2 examples. We might see with the AIDS movement and the People's Health movement, a revival of the spirit, perhaps to get this pandemic under control through state-run vaccine programs with generic medicines that are delinked once we can get rid of intellectual property. Maybe Sinovac, maybe the Cubans, maybe Sputnik, maybe we'll find some strong ally that will help. But the 2 that I would point to that are in place, each with hundreds of members, I've mentioned one, Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, and it has other left-wing competitors out there. But I think the climate crisis is going to be one of those very vital sites for unification of progressives on the continent to demand not only the relief required by climate, but a different, maybe non-fossil intensive strategy. And that would be maybe most acute today in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique. So watch that space, find the solidarity that we all need to make that. The second is over finance, and it's called Tax Justice Network Africa, several hundred organizations, again questioning multinational corporate and banking power that is bleeding Africa. And I think those are NGO specialists. They may not be radicals or revolutionaries, but they do provide sectoral windows into the unification of critical thinking and activism. I hope those are some examples. I wish I could say an African Social Forum, but you know what I do have hope for, because I know Aziz has worked on this and thought about it with good comrades around the world, which is what Samir Amin bequeathed us. So Aziz, would you maybe give us an update on how scholar activists, intellectuals identify with trade unions and radical workers' movements, with social movements, with the youth, with women, with Pan-Africanists, ways forward? Because I think if anyone's carrying forward Pan-Africanism and Samir Amin's last will and testament, Aziz, over to you, comrade.
Well, you know, it's quite a heavy load. Again, you know, basically to make this long story short, the question that Diallo Diop has raised is the central question, but it cannot be incantatory, because our greatest weakness has been to explain the complex dynamics of our oppression to our African masses, and who are legitimately caught up in the management of daily life and the problems of development, and who often perceives these issues of Pan-Africanism as too complex, long-term, or without any capacity to control them, to grasp them. To this must be added the powerlessness of our elites, or their lack of willingness, because of the way they are often dependent of the outside, financially, technologically, even ideologically and militarily. And the central answer here is whether we are sovereign or not. What is the real degree of sovereignty that Africa has today on the local, national level, and as a continent? My reading is that we are not sovereign, and we just have to look at the way we are controlled militarily. And you know the work probably that we have done against the AFRICOM base and the other facilities on the continent that show that actually that we are not fully independent. So to build a spirit of a new internationalism, what I call trans-internationalism, the effort that have been sustained in the past 3 years to really channel the leftist groups, NGOs, trade unions, people who believe that a new internationalism is possible in the 21st century, is shared by different groups. There is us who have followed, you know, Samir Amin's footsteps. There is the International of Sanders and Varoufakis, and we are in discussion with them. There's the International of People also. So there are interesting discussion going on among us. And as you know, we have been working on a roadmap paper to launch this embryo of the international. It's a big effort. But really to come back to the core of what Diallo Diop have described, in fact, for us who are anti-apartheid activists, we lost hope when the RDP was abandoned and replaced by the GAR, which was, as he described, a self-inflicted structural adjustment policy because of Black empowerment bourgeoisie being built, but also the fear to not to lose all the capital investment. As you know, capital investment flew at the time in Canada, in Australia, etc., from South Africa, and it was a blackmail, not just to raise the Inkatha civil war that was there, but also how the whole effort of dismantling the leftist side with the killing of Chris Hani and so on and so on. There's a lot of complex things that are rooted to South Africa, but in our dear hopes, South Africa was leading the process of Pan-Africanism as it was the natural way out after the apartheid period. Unfortunately, the frontline states were still under destabilization, Angola and Mozambique and so on. So, and not to mention Zimbabwe. And so this didn't happen the way our dream were hoping. And the second blow, as I said, was the killing of Gaddafi, even though Gaddafi was not necessarily the mastermind, but he did finance the technological advance for Africa when it comes to the internet, and also finance the core of what was supposed to be our central bank, not to name the effort of a single African army. So we are almost back to square one, even worse, because the institutional framework had been controlled by, Kagame's agenda to go towards the institutional integration with the ZLIAC plan of market-oriented economy and integration of the African market. So I'm not sure we are on the right path with NEPADS and the so-called 2063 agenda. So we need, I think, one of the key thing that we need to look is that any of this protest, movement, dissent that is happening need to be linked to a Pan-African analysis as well. It's not just a local phenomenon. And this is why I was insisting when I was appreciating Patrick's work to really distinguish, and this is not to be romanticizing the thing, is to really distinguish what is the nature of this struggle. What is the difference between resistance, resilience? What is the difference between rebellion and so-called revolution? What type of strata we have to really analyze in terms of what is happening as combative forms of communitary organization, what is combative forms in the streets, what is really popular protest, and how they could be nourishing a Pan-Africanist, strive. But, and I think this is the thing, our generation have chosen what Shehanta Diop has portrayed, what Kwame Nkrumah have portrayed, but I don't really feel in the elites and people who are, governing us, this thirst of Pan-Africanism, even though today you have mushrooms of Pan-Africanism, institutional right-wing Pan-Africanism, Afro-capitalism, and so on. This is why personally I have chosen to really distinguish my view of Pan-Africanism from what is around, as I call it, a Pan-Africentrage, which is a self-reliant Pan-Africanism, rediscovering what is our Africanity, because this is the cultural dimension. What is Africanity? What distinguish us from Asian or from European? Or are we exactly the same? If we have a cultural difference, then it needs to be known and really expressed. And secondly, if it has a political component that could nourish a political project, then it should be also highlighted. And even with some nostalgic efforts, we have tried to show that there are modes of regulation that we can reinvent, drawing from the past. For example, Maat, which is really a question of balance and social justice that could be revisited and analyzed on modern ways. There's other regulation and political systems that are typically African in the way we democratically discuss decision-making processes that could also be reinvented towards a new forms of Pan-Africanism. But the real core is an internationalist, socialist type of delinking based on an internal market of consumption, a different development type of development, and something that is really delinked from the world capitalist system. So those things, unfortunately, are still marginal. And I totally share Jallo Job's view. This is the core element. And we need really to anchor this in all the struggle, that people understand what they fight locally or nationally is in fact deeply rooted into this Pan-African worldview. And when we succeed in that, I think we will succeed in the repoliticization of the Africa uprising. And the real Africa rising is the Pan-African arising. For my view, maybe I'm too romantic or utopian, but I don't see other way out of the system. Just to say that if the 21st century will survive, it's mainly because Africa would be part of the big partition that is leading mankind towards a bright future. If Africa fails, I think this is the human side, the humanistic side of this globalization. What Patrick said, globalization of the people and deglobalized capital will be the only option possible. This is, again, a very romantic view, again, maybe a revolutionary way, but this is the way I see it. Thank you.
Definitely, it was a wonderful presentation he's made, documented as always, well documented with facts and figures, and statistics. There he is now. So that extremely rich, and the conversation around not only the protests but the structural issues and the different ways of understanding what happened on the continent historically, but also now, and the engagement or the controversies between how some of the progressive African scholars, the great thinkers we have, the Samirs and Tandikam, Kandaviris and all of them, and Fanon and Cabral, have been thinking about these issues, as opposed to some of the things that one reads in the Africanist literature, was also extremely great. And then I think how the shifts have occurred over time, what possibilities there are, and what be the issues we have now. And I think Aziz's comments and Jallo Job's contribution have been extremely useful. I think we are in a context that is specific. All the issues that have been there are still on the agenda. All the structural transformation issues are still as important today as they have ever been. In addition, we've had this pandemic that is still around, and with new issues coming up in the context of the pandemic, new forms of dependencies, new complications, new mechanisms of domination emerging. Some of the existing mechanisms becoming more consolidated. And I think the way we negotiate our way out of this pandemic, and we resume the structural transformation process towards a much better Africa, I think will be very, very important. And it has to be Pan-African. I'm completely in agreement with this view that Aziz and all of you have been articulating. I think the future is Pan-African, as far as we are concerned, because that is a condition for regaining the control of our destiny, regaining control of the, regaining the sovereignty that we ought to have, both politically, economically, culturally, intellectually, and otherwise. It being Pan-African doesn't mean that it is disconnected from the global struggles that exist across the South, the global South meaning, and I think that's how we also bring us back into this conversation in the context of a South-South Sustainability Forum, because it's the same struggle. And I think there are a lot of exchanges and lessons that we can learn from each other's experiences. What happened in Latin America has been referred to. What happened in China has been referred to. Is happening in other parts of the world also. I think it's important to connect and learn from these different experiences to make sure that all these things leads us to a much better world and a much better future that we have to make. But that will take a fight. I think the elites we are talking about, and the bourgeoisie and the capital and all these doministers and all of them, that fight will be here to stay. And the more important thing is, how do we wage that fight over the long haul? And make sure that we create the conditions for the fight to be sustainable over the long haul. Others have tried before and then they failed for one reason or the other. But mobilizing people on that interesting and difficult agenda, but it's the only realistic agenda I think that we should be mobilizing for, is really the big issue. And again, would like to thank Margaret and Kinchi for the opportunity to be, part of this conversation. And thank you again one more time, Patrick, for an excellent presentation. And I'm hoping that we'll get it in the form. I'm sure it's a book in the making, or it's already out in the form of a book. And thank you very much, Aziz. Now I understand. I know how to translate Panafricanage in English. Simply self-reliant Pan-Africanism. Merci beaucoup. I didn't know how to translate it. And thanks, Jallo, for the great contribution. Thank you. Back to you, Margaret and Kinchi. And
would I say just one very fast word, which is merci beaucoup. And Kinchi, Margaret, and all, we say viva the spirit of the Global University for Sustainability, viva. Amandla, power, away to the people.
Amandla, I saw your face for a second. Please put it back on again. It's great seeing you. Good to see you. Amanda.
And I would like to say something. I will show you a book. 10 years ago, when we have the first SALL Forum, at the same time, we have a research project on the 7 development countries. It means China, Turkey, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Venezuela, and South Africa. And Patrick is the team leader of the research team of South Africa. And now this book is in Chinese, is the report of the 7 emergent countries. And it was released in January this year. And now the books have already sold out 100,000 copies. Yeah, congratulations to all of us. Yeah, and we are so happy. So because it's continued not only our research products, but also the forum, because it's a base of friendship and also intellectual community. And I also want to show the book. It is the Professor Wen monograph, 10 Crises, the Political Economy of China's Development from 1949 to 2020. It is free download from Global University website and also the Paragraph Macmillan. And I would like to say that the land revolution is the very important based on the China's development. And we still defend the small peasantry and also the land collective ownership. And particularly during the pandemic, we also guarantee the majority have access to land, food, shelter, and social distancing. And we work very hard to not only to the urbanization. That means we build our rural communities, and also we empower the young generation with a critical mind, and also prepare to fight against the financial capitalism. So we have some discussion and also experience about the financialization and also digital yuan, and also the digital community currency. So all is still ongoing, and we believe that we explore different alternatives to rebuild a kind of socialist, and also is based on the community-based regeneration. So another thing we think that is very important, we try to to fight against the food sovereignty. At the same time, we also to fight for the herbal. I would say that resource sovereignty, including the local herbs. So we visit against the importance of traditional medicine. It's also kind of decolonizing the knowledge. So we have a section about the traditional medicine, and we plan to do the interview, and also to invite Dr. Duke to give us a presentation about the traditional medicine in Africa based on African experience. So I think it's very important to facilitate this kind of the social exchanges and also solidarity through the mutual decolonizing knowledge, because Western medicine is also powerful in China. So how to fight for the food sovereignty, resource sovereignty, and also the drugs or the medicine sovereignties. I would anyway, we can use another name, but how can that means how can we have people's sovereignty over the food and also drug? I think in the next at least 10 years, we still fight against the COVID-19. So it's not over, not post or post-COVID. So how can we have the sovereignty over the medical health and also the herbal or traditional medicine? How can we recognize and fight for this our rights to the traditional wisdom? So I think it's very important.